He had dismissed 13 women, 13 attempts, 13 failures. His son hadn't spoken since his mother left. Only silence, dry tears, eyes that looked without seeing, until she arrived. A simple woman with an old shawl that smelled of the sea and hands cracked by life. And that afternoon, when the rain lashed against the windows, she began to sing, a song that his mother also used to sing, and for the first time in 6 months, the boy smiled. Like this, if it touched your soul. It's not just a click, it's a silent embrace between those of us who know what it is to lose and to find again. Comment how you think this story will end. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it costs you nothing. But for us, it means the entire world. Thank you for being here, truly. Blackwood Manor stood in the heart of Boston as a monument to pain. Its light stone walls, which once reflected the golden light of happy afternoons, now seemed to absorb the sadness of the grey November sky. It was 1894, and the death of Mrs. Elizabeth had left something worse than silence in that house. It had left emptiness. Rose Milton stepped down from the carriage with a small suitcase that contained everything she owned in the world. The cold afternoon wind ruffled her brown hair, pulled back in a simple bun, and the old shawl she wore over her shoulders, inherited from her Breton grandmother, smelled of sea salt and time past. She was 42 years old, but looked older. Life had not been generous to her. The butler, a man with a severe face named Harrison, watched her from the entrance with a mixture of weariness and poorly disguised pity. "You must be the new one," he said without inflection in his voice. "The 14th in 6 months." Rose nodded silently. She knew what that number meant. She also knew that words were unnecessary when dignity was at stake. "Mr. Blackwood will receive you in the study. Follow me." The inner hallways were spacious but gloomy. Portraits of ancestors looked down from the walls with dead eyes. The ticking of a grandfather clock marked time with cruel precision. Everything in that house seemed designed to remind them that joy had departed forever. Victor Blackwood was standing in front of a window when Rose entered. He was an imposing man with broad shoulders and dark hair barely touched by the first strands of grey. He wore an impeccable suit of English wool, but his shoulders carried an invisible weight that no tailoring could conceal. When he turned to look at her, Rose saw in his eyes something she recognized immediately, the same expression she had seen in the mirror for years after losing her own daughter, the grief that consumes from within. "Mrs. Milton," he said with a firm but cold voice. "I assume Harrison has already informed you about the circumstances." "Yes, sir. My son Peter does not speak. He does not smile. He barely eats. The doctors say it is psychological trauma stemming from the loss of his mother. 13 women have tried to help him. All of them failed." Victor approached her with measured steps, studying her like one evaluating a doubtful investment. "You don't seem to have any special training. You do not come recommended by any prominent family. In fact, your letter of introduction is modest, to say the least." Rose kept her gaze lowered, not out of submission, but out of respect. She knew that any word in her defense would sound like desperation. "So, why should I hire you?" The question hung in the air like a sentence. Rose slowly looked up and met Victor's grey eyes. "Because, sir, I also lost someone, and I know that silence is not the absence of words. It is a way of protecting the little that still hurts." For an instant, something changed in the businessman's expression. It was barely a blink, an almost imperceptible tremor at the corner of his lips, but immediately the coldness returned. "Your responsibilities are clear. Cleaning, tidiness, basic meal preparation. Do not try to speak to my son. That never works. Do not touch him. Do not invade his space. Confine yourself to doing your job in silence." "Understood, sir. If in 2 weeks I see no change, or if you make the same mistake as the others and decide you can cure Peter with good intentions, you will be dismissed without references. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear." Victor made a gesture with his hand, ending the conversation. Harrison, who had remained in the doorway, motioned for Rose to follow him. As they climbed the stairs to the attic where her room would be, Rose heard a sound that chilled her soul, the muffled crying of a child coming from some distant room. It was a cry without words, without plea, without hope. The cry of someone who has learned that shouting is useless. Rose's room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, an old dresser, and a window overlooking the back garden. From there she could see the rose bushes that must once have been magnificent, and that now grew wild, uncared, or as if they too had gone into mourning. She unpacked her suitcase with slow movements, hanging her 2 simple dresses and placing the only photograph she possessed on the dresser, her daughter Emily, at 5 years old, smiling under an apple tree. The image was worn from years of being touched by fingers seeking to remember the warmth of that skin. "Help me help him," Rose whispered to the photograph, as she had done every night for 12 years. The next morning, she began her routine before dawn. The mansion woke up slowly, and Rose moved through it like a silent ghost, cleaning, tidying, arranging each object with a delicacy that bordered on the reverential. It was her way of respecting the pain of others, treating everything as if it were sacred. It was on the 3rd day when she saw him for the first time. She was dusting the handrail of the main staircase when she sensed a presence. Turning her head, she found him, Peter Blackwood, barely 7 years old, observing her from the end of the hallway. He was a beautiful boy with dark blonde hair and eyes the same stormy grey as his father's, but those eyes did not shine. They were like windows covered by heavy curtains, blocking any light trying to enter. He wore an immaculate sailor suit, too immaculate for a boy his age, and stood motionless, hands at his sides, like a lead soldier. Rose remembered Victor's instructions. Do not speak. Do not approach. She forced herself to continue her work, but she felt the weight of that gaze on the back of her neck for long minutes, until the boy disappeared without a sound. This scene repeated itself for days. Peter appeared in the corridors, always at a distance, always in silence, observing Rose's every movement as if he were studying an inexplicable phenomenon. The other employees, the cook, Mrs. Gable, and the young maid, Clara, commented in the kitchen with voices full of pity and resignation. "He's a lost cause," Clara would say while peeling potatoes. "That child will never be normal again. His poor mother was an angel," Mrs. Gable added, "and he was her adoration. When she died, something broke inside him. Doctors say he might never recover." Rose listened without participating, drying dishes with mechanical movements. She did not judge those women. She knew that people talk about the pain of others when they don't know how to face it. But at night, alone in her room, Rose found herself thinking about Peter, about how his small steps echoed through the house, like echoes of a life that had been suspended, about how his grey eyes followed her with something that was neither curiosity nor fear, but something deeper, recognition, as if the boy knew, without words, that she too carried a ghost. Autumn advanced over Boston with its mantle of golden leaves and increasingly leaden skies. Blackwood Manor seemed isolated from time, locked in its own perpetual winter. Rose fulfilled her duties with almost monastic discipline. She woke before dawn, prepared the breakfast Peter barely touched, cleaned rooms no one used, and in the afternoons retreated to her room before Victor returned from his downtown offices. The businessman barely exchanged words with her. Sometimes she would see him from the window, walking alone in the garden at dusk, hands in his pockets and his gaze lost. It was evident that work was his only escape, but even that strategy was failing. His face looked more haggard every day. One afternoon of intense rain, Rose was in the second-floor guest room, folding freshly washed sheets. The sound of the storm hitting the windows brought back memories of Brittany, of the nights her mother lulled her to sleep while the Atlantic roared against the cliffs. Without realizing it, she began to hum. It was an old melody, passed down through generations in Breton fishing families, a simple lullaby in a dialect that mixed Old French with Celtic influences. Dors, mon petit, dors, la mer veille sur toi, les anges gardent la porte et... Maman reste là. Rose's voice was soft, barely a murmur that blended with the sound of the rain. It was not a trained voice, nor particularly beautiful, but it had something that perfect voices often lack: truth. She was so absorbed in the memory that she did not hear the footsteps. She did not perceive the presence until a sound made her stop abruptly. A choked breath, a sigh that seemed to hold years of contained tears. Rose turned slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs. Peter was in the doorway, but something had changed. His eyes were no longer closed windows. They were open, bright, filled with an emotion so intense it was almost painful to look at them. Tears ran down his pale cheeks. "Mommy," the boy whispered in a voice that seemed to come from a very deep and distant place. Mommy used to sing that. Rose's heart stopped. For an endless instant she didn't know what to do. Victor's instructions echoed in her mind. Do not try to speak to my son. Do not touch him. But there was something stronger than the rules, something that no order could annul, the maternal instinct to hold a pain you recognize as your own. She knelt down slowly, keeping her distance, letting Peter decide. Do you want me to sing it for you? She asked with a sweetness that made her own voice tremble. The boy did not respond with words. He nodded slightly, and then, with uncertain steps, like one walking on thin ice, he approached. Rose continued the song, this time clearer, more enveloping. Peter stopped in front of her, and slowly, very slowly, he leaned his head on the shoulder of this woman he barely knew, but who, in some inexplicable way, smelled of safety. And then the miracle happened. Peter smiled. It was not a large or dramatic smile. It was barely a shy curvature of the lips, a fleeting flash of light in the middle of the darkness. But it was real. Rose felt something break inside her chest. She hugged the boy delicately, as if he were made of glass, and continued singing. As the rain washed the windows and the outside world disappeared, she did not know how long they stayed like that. It could have been minutes or an eternity. She only knew that when Peter finally pulled away, something fundamental had changed between them. The boy looked at her with those grey eyes that now seemed to be waking from a long, dark dream. "Thank you," he whispered, before leaving the room with lighter steps than Rose had ever seen him walk. She remained kneeling on the floor, trembling. She knew she had just broken the most important rule. She knew she would probably be fired, but for the first time in 12 years, she didn't care. Victor Blackwood arrived home later than usual that evening. The meeting with the British investors had dragged on, and his mind was saturated with figures, contracts, and decisions he had to make before the end of the month. But as he opened the back door leading to the garden, his way of avoiding unnecessary encounters with the staff, he stopped abruptly. Laughter. For a second he thought his mind was playing a cruel trick on him. Perhaps it was fatigue or the wine he had had during the business dinner. But no, the sound was real, clear, impossible to ignore. A child's laughter. His heart pounded. With quick steps that bordered on panic, Victor crossed the hall and went out into the back garden. What he saw left him breathless. Peter was running among the rose bushes. He was truly running, arms open, and an expression of joy so pure that it seemed impossible that this same child had spent 6 months in sepulchral silence, and sitting on the wet lawn, with the shawl over her shoulders and her hands clapping the rhythm of a song, was Rose. She was singing the same melody she had sung that afternoon, and Peter was circling her, as if she were the center of a newly discovered universe. Victor felt his legs weaken. He leaned against the doorframe, unable to move, unable to process what he was witnessing. Everything he had, fought against for months, the pain, the frustration, the impotence, collapsed like a house of cards. Tears flowed without permission, hot and liberating, washing away months of self-imposed rigidity. Rose perceived his presence. Her face turned pale, and she stopped singing abruptly. She stood up awkwardly, lowering her gaze, preparing for the inevitable reprimand. But Peter did not stop. Seeing his father, he ran toward him with a smile Victor thought he would never see again. "Papa, Papa, listen. She knows Mommy's song." The businessman fell to his knees. It wasn't a conscious decision. His legs simply couldn't support him anymore. He hugged his son with a desperate force, burying his face in his small shoulder as everything he had contained for endless months finally found release. Peter, surprised by the intensity of his father's emotion, hugged him too, with those thin arms that now seemed to have the strength to anchor a man about to drown. Rose remained at a distance, hands clasped and her heart pounding with equal parts fear and hope. Victor looked up at her. His eyes, normally so controlled, were red and swollen. "How—" his voice broke. "How did you do this?" Peter took his father's hand and pulled him toward Rose. "Come, Papa. She sings like Mommy. She sings just like her." Rose knelt to be at their level, with a humility that was not feigned but deeply rooted. "I did nothing extraordinary, sir," she said in a trembling voice. I just shared something that I also carry with me. Pain is healed when someone dares to truly listen to it." Victor looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. She was no longer the insignificant employee he had hired without hope. She was the woman who had achieved the impossible. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Forgive me for treating you as if you didn't matter. There is nothing to forgive." Peter, with that inexplicable wisdom children sometimes possess, took the hands of both adults and joined them. "Now we are three," he said seriously. Victor Blackwood, the unbreakable businessman who had built a commerce empire, felt something inside him definitively yield. For the first time in months, Blackwood Manor breathed. The following weeks brought a palpable change to the manor. Peter began to speak again, not with the fluency of before, but with short phrases that sounded like rediscovery. He asked for the names of flowers, wanted to hear stories from Brittany, asked Rose to sing to him every night before bed. Victor, for his part, modified his routine. He now returned earlier from work, had dinner with Peter, and sometimes stayed in the garden listening to the songs Rose sang for the boy. He did not participate directly. There was still a distance that grief had built, but his presence was a silent form of gratitude. However, not everyone in the house viewed these changes favorably. Clara, the young maid, had worked for the Blackwoods since before Mrs. Elizabeth's death. She had secretly aspired to occupy a more important place in Victor's life, and Rose's arrival had disrupted those invisible plans. One afternoon, while Rose was preparing Peter's snack in the kitchen, she heard voices in the hallway. She recognized Clara's, speaking in a tone loud enough to ensure she was heard. "It's suspicious, that's all I'm saying," Clara was commenting to Mrs. Gable. "A woman who arrives out of nowhere, with no important references, and in a few weeks has the boy eating out of her. And the master, too." "The boy is better," the cook replied cautiously. "That's undeniable. Or is she manipulating him? I've seen women like that. They pretend to be saints, humble, but they are calculating every step. I bet before winter she'll be wearing the late mistress's jewels." Rose clenched her fingers against the edge of the table. It wasn't the first time she had heard such comments. In the houses of the wealthy, employees often measured each other as if life were a competition. 4 crumbs of attention, but it hurt nonetheless. That night, as she tucked Peter into bed, the boy sensed something on her face. "Are you sad, Rose?" She tried to smile, smoothing the blankets with trembling hands. "No, my treasure, just tired. Clara says mean things about you," Peter whispered. "I heard her talking to Papa." Rose's heart contracted. People sometimes speak without thinking. It's not important. But Papa didn't believe her. The boy continued with that brutal honesty of 7-year-olds. "He told her that you are the only one who understands me, and that she should mind her own business." Rose felt a mix of relief and shame. She did not want to be a source of conflict in that house. "Sleep, little one. Tomorrow will be a better day." But Peter took her hand before she could stand up. "Are you going to leave?" "Why do you say that?" "Because they all left. They always left. And I don't want you to leave." The boy's eyes filled with tears, and Rose felt her own. Heartbreak. "I'm not going to leave," she promised, although she wasn't sure she could keep it. "I'm here, and I'm going to stay as long as you need me." Peter hugged her tightly, and Rose sang until sleep overtook him. Upon leaving the room, she found Victor waiting in the hallway. His expression was inscrutable under the dim light of the chandeliers. "I need to speak with you, Mrs. Milton." The tone was not hostile, but it wasn't kind either. Rose felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "Of course, sir." Victor Blackwood's study was a sanctuary of refined masculinity. Walls lined with books, a dark mahogany desk, maps of trade routes hung like works of art. The smell of pipe tobacco and old paper permeated every corner. Victor indicated a chair in front of the desk, but he did not sit. He remained standing next to the window, looking out at the dark garden. "I have received comments," he began, choosing his words carefully, "about your relationship with Peter." Rose kept her hands clasped in her lap, bracing for the worst. "Some members of the staff feel that you have transgressed certain boundaries, that your closeness to my son is not appropriate for someone in your position." "I understand, sir." "You understand?" Victor turned abruptly. "Because I'm not sure I understand it. For 6 months, 13 women tried to reach Peter, some with impeccable credentials, recommendations from the best families in New York, and all of them failed. You arrive with no resume other than a letter written on cheap paper, and in 2 weeks you achieve what they couldn't in months." Rose looked up. There was no hostility in Victor's voice. There was something more complex. Confusion. gratitude and perhaps a touch of vulnerability he was trying to hide. "I don't have an elaborate answer, sir," she said honestly. "I can only tell you that I recognized Peter's pain because I have lived it myself. I lost my daughter 12 years ago. She was 5. A fever took her in 3 days." Victor closed his eyes. "I'm sorry." "Emily," Rose continued, feeling the words flow without filter. "Her name was Emily. And the song I sing, it was the one my mother sang to me, and I to her." When Peter heard it, something in him recognized that language, the language of love that survives loss. The silence that followed was dense but not uncomfortable. Victor finally sat on the edge of the desk, his shoulders slumped. "My wife was extraordinary," he said hoarsely. "Elizabeth, she was the light of this house. When she died, yet when I saw her go, something went out in me too. And seeing Peter sink into that silence it was like dying twice. I know. The doctors told me it was best not to talk about it, that mentioning his mother would only worsen the trauma. So I removed all her photographs, stored her belongings, forbade her name from being spoken. I thought I was protecting my son. You were doing what you thought was best. But I was wrong." Victor's voice cracked. "Terribly wrong. And you did exactly the opposite. You gave him permission to remember, to love even in the absence." Rose stood up, maintaining a respectful distance. "Pain does not disappear by ignoring it, Mr. Blackwood. It only transforms. And sometimes the only way to heal it is to go through it." Victor looked at her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "Have you healed it? Your pain?" "Not entirely," she admitted. "But I have learned to live with it. Like a scar that, no longer bleeds, but that reminds you who you were and who you are now." The businessman nodded slowly, accepting something that seemed inevitable. "Stay, Mrs. Milton. Not just because Peter needs you, but because I think this house needs you too." Rose felt something warm blossom in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. "Thank you, sir." When she left the study, Clara was observing her from the shadows of the hallway. Her gaze contained pure poison, but Rose no longer felt afraid. She had learned long ago that the deepest wounds do not come from the envy of others, but from one's own silence. December arrived in Boston with its usual winter melancholy, but inside Blackwood Manor, something was beginning to bloom. Peter recovered words like one recovers lost treasures. He spoke of his mother without crying, remembering small things, how she taught him to identify constellations, how she prepared hot chocolate on cold afternoons, how she always smelled of lavender. Rose listened with maternal attention and sometimes added her own stories about Emily, not to compare pains, but to show Peter that love does not die with absence. Victor began to join these evening conversations. At first he remained silent, but gradually he participated, sharing anecdotes about Elizabeth that he had kept hidden like dangerous secrets. One afternoon, while they were decorating the living room for Christmas, Peter had insisted, saying his mother would have wanted a tree. The boy asked a question that left everyone motionless. "Rose, are you going to stay forever?" She was standing on a small ladder, hanging garlands. She climbed down slowly, searching for the right words. "I don't know what forever means, my little one, but I am here now and that is what matters. I want you to stay forever," the boy insisted with that innocent stubbornness, like a new mommy. The silence that followed was dense. Rose felt the color drain from her face. Victor, who had been organizing books on a shelf, froze. "Peter," Rose began in a trembling voice, "no one can replace your mother, and I know," the boy interrupted with a seriousness that seemed too great for his age, "but Mommy is gone, and you are here, and Papa smiles when you sing, and I'm not afraid at night anymore." Victor approached his son, kneeling in front of him. "Son, what Rose does for us is invaluable, but she has her own life, her own—" "Do you have another family?" Peter asked Rose directly, with those grey eyes that seemed to see through defenses. "No," she admitted. "I don't have anyone else." "Then stay with us," the boy pleaded. "Please." Rose looked at Victor, seeking help, but found something unexpected on his face. Hope. He didn't say anything, but his eyes conveyed the same plea his son expressed aloud. I need to think," Rose whispered, feeling the walls close in and open up at the same time. That night, alone in her attic room, Rose cried for the first time since her Arrival at the manor, not from sadness, but from something more complex, the terrifying possibility of belonging to something again, of risking loss again. Clara had not abandoned her silent campaign. If she couldn't expel Rose directly, at least she could sow doubt. She began dropping comments in the presence of occasional visitors, the family doctor, Victor's lawyer, the wives of business partners who came to visit. It is admirable how certain women know exactly what to do to secure their future, she would say with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes, especially when there is a vulnerable widower and a traumatized child involved. The insinuations were subtle enough not to be directly confronted, but clear enough to plant seeds of suspicion. One afternoon, while Rose was helping Peter with his reading lessons in the library, she heard raised voices coming from Victor's study. "Mr. Blackwood, as your lawyer and friend, I must express my concern." It was the voice of Mr. Sterling, an older man who had advised the family for decades. "The rumors about your closeness to the housemaid are beginning to circulate in certain circles." "What rumors?" Victor's voice sounded dangerously controlled. "That she has manipulated the child to gain your trust, that you, in your vulnerable state, are being influenced. Some people even suggest that her true intentions should be investigated. That is absurd." "Perhaps. But perception is everything in our world, Victor. It's one thing to hire an employee. It's quite another to allow her to become a mother figure to your son. Class differences exist for important reasons." Peter, who had been listening next to Rose, squeezed her hand tightly. "He doesn't know anything," the boy whispered indignantly. "He doesn't know what you were like before and what you are like now." Rose put a finger to his lips, signaling silence, but her heart was beating painfully. She knew the lawyer wasn't entirely wrong. She was an employee. Victor was a prominent businessman. Peter was the heir to a considerable fortune. What right did she have to insert herself into their lives so profoundly? That night, during dinner, Victor was unusually quiet. Rose served the food and quickly withdrew, feeling that something had changed in the air. Later, while she was preparing Peter's bath, the boy looked at her worriedly. "Are you going to leave? Because people say bad things." "No, treasure. Do you promise me?" Rose wanted to promise, but the words got stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply hugged the boy, letting her silence speak for her. Victor Blackwood had not gotten where he was by ignoring problems. He had built his empire by facing every challenge with logic, strategy, and determination. But this was different. For the first time in his adult life, his heart and his reason pulled in opposite directions. Reason told him that Sterling had valid arguments. Society had expectations. His position required certain appearances. Rose was an employee, and allowing that relationship to evolve into something more could bring social, legal, and even commercial complications. But his heart showed him something simpler and more powerful. Peter was laughing. His son, who had spent 6 months as a living ghost, now ran, played, asked questions, dreamed of the future, and all that had begun with a song. That night, after Peter fell asleep, Victor went to the attic. It was the first time he had climbed those stairs. Rose's door was ajar and a faint light filtered from within. He knocked gently. "Mrs. Milton, may I come in?" Rose opened it, surprised. She was wearing a simple white nightgown, and her loose hair fell over her shoulders. She looked vulnerable, younger than she appeared during the day. "Mr. Blackwood, I need you to hear something," he said, entering just enough to maintain propriety but close enough for his words to be clear. "Today, my lawyer came to warn me about you, about us, about what people are saying." Rose lowered her gaze. "I know. I heard it. And you probably think I came to ask you to leave. Isn't that the case?" Victor let out a bitter laugh. 6 months ago, that would have been exactly it. I would have prioritized my reputation, my social position, the opinions of men like Sterling who believe the world should run according to rules written 100 years ago. "And now," Rose whispered, "now I look at my son, and I see life. I see future. And I know that is more valuable than any opinion, any rumor, any social judgment." Rose's eyes filled with tears. "But I am not from your world, Mr. Blackwood. I am a simple woman without refined education, without—" "You are the woman who saved my son," he interrupted with a firm voice. "You are the woman who reminded me that I can still feel, that I can honor Elizabeth's memory without turning into a marble statue. People will talk. Let them talk. I have spent too long living for the expectations of others. My wife, Elizabeth, always told me that true nobility is not in surnames but in actions. And you, Rose, have shown more nobility in these months than many who call themselves aristocrats. I don't know what to say. Say that you will stay, not as an employee, as part of this family, as someone who matters. The silence that followed was charged with possibilities. Rose looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't seen before. Not only gratitude, but respect. And perhaps, barely, perceptible, the beginning of something deeper. I will stay, she finally whispered. As long as you need me, I will stay. Victor nodded, and for a moment it seemed he was going to say something more, but instead he simply took Rose's hand and squeezed it with a warmth that spoke of promises yet unspoken. January 1895 arrived with snow and challenges. The rumors Clara had sown flourished in the salons of Boston like poisonous weeds. Mrs. Blackwood, as some sarcastically began to call Rose, became the topic of conversation at afternoon teas and social gatherings. The stories were distorted, that she had seduced the widower, that she had manipulated the child, that she was a fortune hunter disguised as a saint. Victor faced the whispers with dignified silence. He stopped attending certain social events where he knew Rose would be the object of cruel scrutiny. This only fueled more speculation. Peter, oblivious to social complexity but sensitive to the tense atmosphere, became more protective of Rose. If someone spoke ill of her in his presence, the boy defended her with a passion that surprised even the adults. "She saved me when all of you couldn't," he yelled one afternoon at the family doctor, who had insinuated that Rose might not be an appropriate influence, and my mommy would have loved her. The crisis came one afternoon in February, when Elizabeth's sister, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, appeared at the manor without prior announcement. She was a tall, elegant woman in her 50s, who wore her widowhood like a banner of moral superiority. She had been traveling in Italy for months, and had just returned to hear about the scandals surrounding her brother-in-law. "Where is that woman?" she demanded upon entering, completely ignoring Harrison. Victor received her in the living room with cold courtesy. "Eleanor, I didn't know you were back. Obviously, had I known, you would never have allowed this situation to go so far." "What situation?" "Don't play the fool. All of Boston is talking about how a housemaid has taken over this house, over my nephew, over my sister's memory." "Lower your voice," Victor ordered. "Peter doesn't need to hear this. Peter needs structure. He needs to be raised by people of his class, not some peasant who probably doesn't even know how to read correctly." At that moment, Rose appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with tea. She had heard everything but maintained her composure, her head held high and her movements precise. Eleanor assessed her with a look that could freeze water. "So you are the famous Mrs. Milton?" "Good afternoon, madam," Rose replied, setting down the tray with steady hands. "I regret that the circumstances of our meeting are uncomfortable." "There is nothing uncomfortable here except your presence." "How much?" "I beg your pardon?" "How much money do you want to leave?" "To disappear and let this family heal appropriately." The silence that followed was brutal. Victor stood up, furious. But Rose raised a hand, stopping him. "I do not want your money, Mrs. Vance," she said with a calm that contrasted with the storm she must have felt inside. "And I will not disappear. But I understand your pain. Losing a sister. There are no words for that. Don't you dare speak to me of loss." "I lost my daughter," Rose continued without raising her voice. "She was 5 years old. Her name was Emily. So yes, madam, I know something about pain. And I know that when one suffers it, one sometimes projects that pain onto others because it is easier than facing it." Eleanor blinked, momentarily disarmed. "I did not come here to be psychoanalyzed by a servant." "You came because you love your nephew," Rose said firmly. "And that is exactly what I do too. Without ulterior motives, without plans. Just love." At that moment, Peter ran into the living room, oblivious to the tension. "Aunt Eleanor!" he shouted with genuine joy, launching himself into her arms. The woman hugged him, and for a moment, her armor cracked. She looked at the boy, truly looked at him, and saw what everyone else had already seen, that Peter was alive again. "You've grown so much," she whispered, "and now I can read whole stories." Rose teaches me every night. Do you want me to read you one? Eleanor looked at Rose over Peter's head. Something in her expression changed. It wasn't total acceptance, but it wasn't pure hostility either. Perhaps later, she replied softly. That night, before retreating to the guesty room, Eleanor sought out Rose in the kitchen. I don't trust you, she said without preamble, and I probably never will completely. But Peter is happy, and that is something I thought I would never see again. It's all that matters, Rose replied. If you ever hurt him, I won't. Eleanor nodded slowly, evaluating her one last time before retiring. March brought with it the first signs of spring. The rose bushes in the garden began to sprout again, and with them something else also blossomed. At Blackwood Manor, Victor and Rose had developed a routine that, without formal words, increasingly resembled that of a family. They had breakfast together with Peter, shared evening readings, discussed the boy's education. But there was something else. Glances that lingered a second longer than necessary, hands that brushed against each other when passing documents or teacups, smiles that contained entire conversations. One rainy afternoon, while Peter was taking his nap, Victor found Rose in the library, reading a book on astronomy. Are you interested? He asked, pointing to the book. Peter wants to know about the stars. He says his mother used to tell him stories about constellations. Victor sat in the armchair opposite her, allowing the silence to settle comfortably between them. Elizabeth believed that every star was a soul watching over us from above, he finally said. She used to tell Peter that when she died, she would become the brightest one. She was a wise woman. She was. And I know she would be grateful to you. Rose looked up, surprised. Don't say that just because. I'm not saying it out of courtesy, Victor interrupted her. I'm saying it because it's true. Elizabeth always said that true love is not possessive. It does not seek replacements or threaten memories. It simply exists. And I think she would have seen in you what I see. And what do you see? Victor leaned forward, holding her gaze. I see someone who turned our darkness into light. Not by erasing the past, but by illuminating it in such a way that we can look at it without being destroyed. Tears welled up in Rose's eyes. I'm afraid, she admitted. Afraid that this is temporary. That one day you will wake up and realize you made a mistake by letting me stay. The only mistake I made was taking so long to tell you this. Victor took her hand, intertwining their fingers. Rose, I don't know exactly what this feeling is. I know it's not the same as what I felt for Elizabeth, and it would be dishonest to pretend that it is. But it is real, it is deep, and I think it deserves to be explored. People will say, let them say what they want. I have learned that the opinion of others is the price you pay for living authentically, and I prefer to live with truth than to exist in appearances. Rose squeezed his hand, feeling something fundamental shifting between them. I feel something too, she whispered. Something that scares me because I didn't expect to feel it. Again, after Emily, after everything I lost, I thought that part of me had died. But it didn't die. No, it was just asleep. And you and Peter, woke me up. Victor moved closer, and for a moment it seemed he was going to kiss her. But instead, he rested his forehead against hers in a gesture of intimacy so profound that words were unnecessary. They remained like that, breathing together, until they heard Peter's steps coming down the stairs. The boy found them together and smiled with that inexplicable wisdom of children who see what adults try to hide. Now can we really be a family? He asked with pure hope. Victor and Rose looked at each other, and in that shared silence, they made a decision that would change everything. Victor Blackwood was not a man of impulsive decisions, but he knew how to recognize the truth when it was in front of him. For weeks, he considered every angle, every consequence, every possible social objection. Finally, on an afternoon in April, he made the decision that his heart had been whispering to him for months. He hired the most discreet notary in Boston and prepared the necessary documents. It would not be a grand wedding. Society was still too close to Elizabeth's mourning to accept that. But it would be legitimate, honest, and celebrated before God. When he proposed marriage to Rose, he did it in the simplest way possible, kneeling in the garden where Peter had laughed again, with the boy as witness. I don't offer you a fairy tale, Victor said, holding both her hands. I offer you a real life with real challenges. in a world that will probably never fully accept you, but I also offer you my respect, my gratitude, and something that grows every day, my love." Rose cried, not from sadness but from a happiness so overwhelming that it hurt. "Yes," she replied, 1,000 times, yes. The ceremony was held in May, in the small private chapel of the manor. Only Peter, Harrison, Mrs. Gable, and surprisingly, Eleanor, who had softened her stance after months of observing her nephew's genuine transformation, were present. Clara had resigned weeks earlier, unable to bear her silent defeat. The local priest, Father Michael, who had known the Blackwood family for decades, conducted the ceremony with words that spoke not of tradition but of redemption. "True love does not always arrive in the packages we expect," he said, as he blessed the rings. "Sometimes it arrives discreetly, disguised as service, as nighttime songs, as hands that heal without expecting anything in return. And when that love appears, to reject it would be to reject God himself." Rose wore a simple ivory dress, nothing ostentatious, nothing that could be interpreted as disrespect toward Elizabeth's memory. Victor wore his best suit, but what shone brighter than the fine fabric was the genuine smile that had been absent for so long. Peter served as the ring-bearer, with a seriousness that would have been comical if it weren't so moving. When the priest asked if anyone had objections, the boy declared firmly, "I say yes, they should get married, because Rose makes Papa Papa again." There was soft laughter, contained tears, and finally, when Victor kissed Rose, it was as if the entire manor exhaled a sigh of relief. That night there was an intimate dinner. Eleanor raised her glass with a grace that cost visible effort. "To second chances," she said, "and to those who have the courage to take them." Everyone toasted, and in that moment, Rose felt something she hadn't experienced in more than a decade: belonging. The following months were not easy. Boston society, predictable in its hypocrisy, reacted with contained scandal. Some families stopped inviting Victor to social events. Certain business partners began to question his judgment. But Victor had anticipated this. His commercial empire was solid enough to survive temporary social ostracism, and he discovered something liberating, that the approval of strangers meant much less than he had always believed. Rose faced more subtle but equally painful challenges. On the few occasions she accompanied Victor to public events, she endured scrutinizing glances, barely disguised whispers, false smiles from women who saw her as an intruder. One afternoon, at a charity tea that Victor insisted they attend, a particularly venomous countess approached Rose. "It must be fascinating," she said with poisoned sweetness, "to go from cleaning floors to being the lady of the house. I imagine the etiquette lessons must be challenging." Rose could have shrunk away. She could have allowed shame to consume her, but something in her had changed. She was no longer the defeated woman who had arrived at the manor a year ago. "It's true," she replied with a calm that surprised even herself. "I never learned to feign superiority where real virtue does not exist. That particular lesson seems to have eluded me." The Countess blinked, momentarily silenced. Other nearby women hid, smiles behind their fans. That night, Victor told her proudly, "You don't need to be like them. You are better than them." But the true triumph came unexpectedly. Peter, now 8 years old, began attending the prestigious St. Andrew's Academy. At first, some parents expressed concern about the boy's new family situation, but Peter, with the resilience only children possess, earned the respect of classmates and teachers for his kindness, intelligence, and emotional maturity. At the first parents' meeting, the headmaster, Mr. Albright, a respected educator throughout Boston, requested to speak privately with Victor and Rose. "I want to thank you," he began to their surprise. "In my 30 years as an educator, I have rarely seen a transformation like Peter's. He came to us 6 months ago as a traumatized child, and now he is one of our most balanced and empathetic students." "We have done the best we can," Victor replied modestly. "No, Mr. Blackwood," the headmaster insisted, looking specifically at Rose. "You have done something extraordinary. And as an educator, I recognize when a child is being raised with genuine love, not social appearances. Peter speaks of his mother Elizabeth with affection and respect, and he speaks of you, Mrs. Blackwood, with an equally deep but different love. You have achieved something many would consider impossible, honoring the past while building a future." Rose felt tears threatening to fall, but she held them back. Peter is an exceptional child. He did all the difficult work. Children can only do that work when adults create the safe space for them to do it, Albright replied firmly. And I want you to know that this school values substance over appearance. We do not care about rumors. We care about results. And Peter is living proof that you are doing something profoundly right. When they left the office, Victor took Rose's hand and squeezed it tightly. See? The truth always finds its way. But Rose knew the battle was not completely won. There were still cold stares on the street, whispered comments in the shops, socially closed doors. However, something had changed inside her. She no longer sought external approval. She had found something more valuable: internal peace. One autumn afternoon, while Peter played in the garden and Victor worked in his study, Rose found herself alone in the living room where everything had begun a year ago. She looked around. The same elegant furniture, the same high windows, the same walls that had witnessed so much pain, and realized that the house no longer felt like a mausoleum. It felt like a home. Eleanor, who now visited regularly, entered at that moment carrying an antique box. "I want to give you something," she said, with a softness that contrasted greatly with her initial hostility. She opened the box and took out a simple but beautiful pearl necklace. "It was my mother's," she explained. "Elizabeth inherited it when she married Victor, and before she died, she made me promise that if Victor ever found someone who truly loved Peter as her own son, that person should have this." Rose felt the ground shift beneath her feet. I can't accept." Elizabeth knew she might die young, Eleanor continued, her voice cracking with emotion. "She had a premonition, and she told me, if Victor loves again, do not judge her by who she is, but by how she treats our son." It took me months to understand, months to accept that my sister had more wisdom than I did. She placed the necklace on Rose with trembling hands. "She would have wanted you to have it, because you gave her son back his life, and that is the only thing she would have asked for." Rose hugged Eleanor, and both women cried together, no longer as adversaries but as allies in the love for a child who had united them in unexpected ways. That night, when Victor saw the necklace, his eyes filled with tears. "Elizabeth would be happy," he whispered, "very happy." And Rose knew without a doubt that she had found her place in the world. It had not been easy. It had required courage, patience, and the willingness to endure the judgment of those who valued appearances more than truth. But it had been worth every tear, every moment of doubt, every cruel glance. Because in the end, genuine love is always worth it. 3 years passed since that first rainy afternoon when a song had awakened a dormant soul. Blackwood Manor had undergone such a profound transformation that those who visited it for the first time could not imagine the grief that had once permeated its walls. Peter, now 10 years old, was a brilliant and compassionate boy who excelled in school not only for his intelligence, but for his extraordinary empathy. Teachers commented with admiration on how he was always the first to defend the shyer children, to include those left out, to offer help without expecting anything in return. One day, during the family lunch, those lunches that were now a happy routine instead of a silent obligation, Peter made an announcement that took everyone by surprise. "I want to do something special for Mommy Elizabeth's Memorial Day," he said with a seriousness that contrasted with his still childish face. Rose and Victor exchanged glances. Every year, the anniversary of Elizabeth's death was a day of quiet reflection. They visited her grave, shared stories, honored her memory. But Peter had never proposed doing anything different. "What do you have in mind, my son?" Victor asked, softly. "I want Rose to sing her song, the song that woke me up. But not just for me. I want her to sing it at St. Jude's Orphanage." The silence that followed was dense with meaning. St. Jude's Orphanage was an institution that Elizabeth had fervently supported during her life. After her death, Victor had continued the donations, but he had never personally visited the place. It was too painful. "Why the orphanage?" Rose asked tenderly. "Because there are children there like me," Peter replied, with a heartbreaking maturity. "Children who lost their mommies, and I thought that maybe the song that helped me could help them too." Victor abruptly stood up from the table, turning to the window to hide the tears that had flowed without permission. Rose extended her hand and gently touched Peter's shoulder. "That is a beautiful idea, treasure." "Mommy Elizabeth always said that love doesn't end with death," the boy continued. that it transforms into actions, and I want to transform what I felt into something that helps others. That simple declaration, uttered by a 10-year-old boy, contained more wisdom than many adults accumulate in a lifetime. Victor turned, his face streaked with tears, but smiling. Your mother would be incredibly proud of you, and I am too. A week later, the entire Blackwood family, Victor, Rose, Peter, and surprisingly Eleanor, who insisted on accompanying them, arrived at St. Jude's Orphanage. It was a modest building on the outskirts of Boston, maintained, with effort by the Sisters of Charity. The Mother Superior, Sister Catherine, received them with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Mr. Blackwood, it is an honor to receive you personally," she said, taking his hand with both of hers. "Your wife was an angel to us, and your donations have kept these doors open during difficult years." "The honor is ours," Victor replied, "and we want to do something special today." Peter stepped forward with that bravery only children have when they deeply believe in something. "Sister, could we gather the children? My mommy Rose wants to sing them a song." Sister Catherine looked at Rose with curiosity, but nodded warmly. Minutes later, approximately 30 children of various ages were sitting in the central courtyard of the orphanage. There were toddlers who could barely walk, some the age of Peter, and teenagers with faces hardened by losses too early. Rose stood in front of them, feeling more vulnerable than she had felt in years. She was not a professional singer. She had no formal training. She only had a song that had once saved a child, and the hope that it could touch other hearts. Peter sat among the children, taking the hand of a little one about 5 years old, who was crying silently. "Children," Rose began in a trembling voice, "I am not a singer. I am just someone who understands the pain many of you carry. I also lost my daughter years ago, and for a long time, I thought that pain would never go away." The children looked at her with that intense attention only given when someone speaks from absolute truth. "But I learned something important," she continued. "Pain doesn't disappear. It transforms. And with the right help, with love, with patience, it can transform into something that makes us stronger, more compassionate, more capable of helping others." She closed her eyes, searching within herself for that place where she kept the most precious and most painful memories, and she began to sing. "Dors mon petit, dors, la mère veille sur toi. Les anges gardent la porte et maman reste là." Her voice rose in the cold afternoon air, simple but charged with an emotion so pure it was impossible not to feel it. It was not a perfect voice, but it was a true voice. Gradually something magical began to happen. Some children closed their eyes, letting the melody envelop them. Others began to rock gently. A little girl, no older than 3, snuggled up against the older boy next to her. And then, one by one, the children began to cry. They were not tears of pure sadness, but of release, tears that had been trapped behind walls of survival, of not being allowed to be weak, of having to be strong when they were too young to be. Victor, watching from the side, felt something break inside him too. He saw in those children a reflection of Peter 3 years ago. He saw in Rose someone who had not only saved his son, but had the power to touch broken souls with something as simple as a song. Eleanor, normally so controlled, put a hand to her heart, fighting back her own tears. When Rose finished the song, the silence that followed was sacred. Then, slowly, Peter began to applaud. The other children followed suit, and soon the courtyard echoed with applause mixed with sobs, laughter, and exclamations. Sister Catherine approached Rose with tears streaming freely down her aged face. "My daughter," she whispered, "you have just done more for these children in 5 minutes than many therapists in months. You have given them permission to feel, to remember, to heal." Rose knelt as the children began to approach. Some hugged her, others simply touched her hand, others asked her to sing again. Peter helped, translating emotions that the youngest could not express in words. One of the older children, a boy about 13 with hard eyes that had seen too much, approached timidly. "Did you really lose someone too?" he asked distrustfully. "Yes," Rose replied without hesitation. "My daughter Emily." "And does it go away someday?" Rose took his hand firmly. "It transforms. It never completely disappears, but it stops being the only thing you feel. You learn to live with it, to honor it, and eventually, You can use that pain to understand others who suffer. The boy nodded slowly, processing the words. Then, to everyone's surprise, he allowed himself to cry, and Rose hugged him, letting him release years of contained tears. Victor approached Sister Catherine as they watched the scene. "Sister, we want to do more than financial donations," he said with determination. "We want to establish a program, music classes, therapy through art, anything that helps these children process their pain in healthy ways." "Mr. Blackwood, that would be—" "And Rose will run it," he interrupted, looking at his wife with absolute pride. "She understands something I took too long to learn, that healing does not come from denying pain, but from going through it with love." Sister Catherine clasped her hands as if in prayer. "It would be a blessing. These children desperately need what you can offer." That afternoon, as the family returned to the manor in their carriage, Peter snuggled between Victor and Rose, exhausted but happy. "We did something good today, didn't we?" the boy whispered. "You did something extraordinary," Victor replied, kissing his head. "Your mother Elizabeth would be radiant with pride." "Both mothers would be," Rose added softly, "because you gave those children a precious gift. You gave them hope." Peter smiled, closing his eyes. At that moment, Rose looked out the carriage window at the sky that was beginning to fill with early stars. She thought of Elizabeth, of Emily, of all the people she had loved and lost. And she knew with a certainty that transcended logic that no true love is ever lost. It only transforms. The following months brought beautiful changes. Rose began visiting the orphanage twice a week, not only to sing but to teach the sisters how to use music as a healing tool. Some of the children began to smile more. Others began to talk about their losses without shame. Victor expanded his donations, but more importantly, he became personally involved. He began taking Peter with him to visit, teaching him from an early age that true privilege is not having much, but being able to give much. Boston society, which had been so critical at first, gradually began to change its narrative. They no longer spoke of the scandal of the businessman who married his employee. They now spoke of the Blackwood family that was transforming lives at the orphanage. One day, almost a year after that first visit to the orphanage, an unexpected letter arrived. It was from the Boston City Council. Victor read it aloud during breakfast with growing disbelief. "Dear Mr. Blackwood, it is our honor to inform you that the City Council has decided to award Mrs. Rose Blackwood the Citizen Merit Medal for her extraordinary work at St. Jude's Orphanage. Her dedication to the most vulnerable children in our city represents the best of human values." Rose dropped her teacup, stunned. That is impossible. You just changed lives," Victor interrupted, his eyes shining. "And now the whole city recognizes it. But I didn't do anything special. I just shared a song." "Sometimes," Peter said with that wisdom that was now natural to him, "the simplest things are the most powerful, like you taught me." The ceremony took place in the main hall of the City Hall, a grandiose space with ceiling frescoes and marble columns. The same people who 3 years earlier had whispered about Victor's inappropriate marriage were present, but now they applauded. The mayor, an older man with imposing whiskers, placed the medal on Rose with solemnity. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said with a resonant voice, "you have taught us a lesson we all needed to learn, that the worth of a person is not measured by their origin, but by their actions. That true nobility is not in titles but in the heart." Rose accepted the medal with humility, but when it was her turn to speak, her voice was firm. "I thank you for this honor, but I do not deserve it alone. It is deserved by everyone who dares to love when the world tells them not to, those who choose compassion over judgment, those who understand that healing is possible even after the most devastating losses." She paused, looking directly at the people who had once judged her. "Years ago I arrived in Boston as a broken woman who was only looking to survive one more day. I had nothing to offer except my own pain and the small wisdom that pain had taught me. And I learned that that is enough, that our wounds, when we allow them to heal properly, become the sources of our greatest strength." Her gaze met Victor and Peter in the first row. "This medal is not mine. It belongs to a brave boy who dared to love again after losing his mother. It belongs to a man who chose truth over appearances. And it belongs to a woman named Elizabeth, who from somewhere taught me that true love never ends, it only transforms." The applause that followed was deafening. But more important than the public recognition was what happened afterward. Several women approached Rose, some with tears in their eyes. "My son also lost his father," said one. "Do you think your method could help him?" "I misjudged your marriage," admitted another, "and now I realize that I was the one who was wrong." Rose received each confession with grace, without a trace of resentment. She had learned that forgiving does not mean forgetting, but releasing the weight of resentment to be able to walk lighter. That night back at the manor, the family gathered in the living room. Peter was lying in Rose's lap, half asleep, while Victor read in his favorite armchair. It was a scene of perfect domesticity, so different from the sepulchral silence that had dominated that same room years ago. "Rose," Victor said, lowering his book, "do you remember the first day you arrived here?" "Every detail," she replied, stroking Peter's hair. "I was terrified, sure that I would fail like all the others." "I was sure of that too," he admitted with a sad smile. "I had lost all hope. I believed Peter was lost forever. But he wasn't," Peter murmured without opening his eyes. "He was just waiting for someone to sing the right song." Rose and Victor looked at each other over the boy's head, sharing a smile that contained years of emotional journey. "Do you know what is most extraordinary?" Victor said. "That you didn't know you had that song in you either. You arrived thinking you were a woman with nothing to offer. And I discovered that what I considered my greatest weakness, the pain of having lost Emily, was actually my greatest strength." Rose completed, "because it allowed me to understand Peter's pain in a way no one else could." "Our wounds prepare us to understand the wounds of others," Victor reflected. "If only we had the wisdom to see them not as flaws but as bridges." Peter sat up slightly, more awake than he had seemed. "Teacher Albright says that I could also help other children when I'm older, children who lost their moms or dads, because I know how it feels." "You would be extraordinary at that," Rose said tenderly, "because you have transformed your pain into empathy." "Is that what it means to be truly strong?" the boy asked. "Not pretending it doesn't hurt, but using what hurts to help." Rose felt tears threatening to fall. The wisdom of that child, forged in the fire of early suffering, was deeper than that of many adults who lived entire lives without facing true pain. "Yes, my treasure, exactly that." Peter hugged her tightly. "Then I want to be strong like you and like Papa, and like Mommy Elizabeth who loves us from the stars." Victor joined the hug, and the three remained like that, intertwined in a comfortable silence that spoke more than 1,000 words. Outside, the Boston night stretched out quietly. Inside Blackwood Manor, the walls that once contained only pain now resonated with something much more powerful: regenerated love, restored hope, and the living proof that no darkness is so deep that it cannot be traversed with the right light. Rose looked at Emily's photograph, which now had a place of honor in the room next to one of Elizabeth. She no longer felt that honoring one meant betraying the other. There was space in the human heart for multiple loves, multiple losses, multiple redemptions. "Thank you," she whispered toward her daughter's photograph, "for teaching me that love survives everything, even death." And at that moment, with her new family embraced around her, Rose Milton, who had arrived at that house as a broken and desperate employee, realized something fundamental. It hadn't been her who had saved Peter and Victor. They had saved her too, because that is how true love works. It is not unidirectional. It is not a rescue where one gives and the other receives. It is a mutual exchange where everyone heals together, where the wounds of some become the medicine of others, where shared darkness transforms into collective light. That night, before everyone retired to sleep, Peter asked for one last thing. "Rose, can you sing the song? One more time." And she sang, with Victor holding her hand and Peter snuggled between them, that simple melody that had changed everything. Her voice rose softly in the still air, of the manor carrying with it years of pain transformed into beauty, of loss turned into purpose, of an end metamorphosed into a new beginning. "Dors, mon petit, dors, la mère veille sur toi, les anges gardent la porte, et maman reste là." When the last note faded, Rose looked at Victor and then at Peter, and spoke the words that had been gestating in her heart during 3 years of transformation. Sometimes the simplest songs awaken the most dormant souls, not because they are perfect, but because they are true, and the truth, when it comes from love, always finds its way home.